What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the 5 games that were the most fun to 100%. Games where I enjoyed that journey a great deal. Though a few things I want to mention at the beginning here, starting with the fact that these aren't my favorite games by any means, as that is a very different list that I've already made. However, to give an example of my favorite game, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, as much as I love that game, getting 100% on that is really brutal. And if I hadn't loved it, I just wouldn't have done it. So with this list, we're talking about games where the actual act of getting 100% was really enjoyable for me, but as always, this is the kind of thing that varies immensely person to person, which I think is really interesting as the channel primarily does reviews, of course, as I'm sure most people watching this are aware. And the thing about reviews is that you want to present a lot of information and give a lot of objective facts on top of opinions. And sometimes that approach will lead people to think that I have a more negative impression of a game than I actually do, which is probably the case for a few of these games. But nonetheless, I found the journey here to be enjoyable. So with all of that said, let's actually kick this list off, starting with Wasteland 3. Wasteland 3 is the review where I decided I could probably make this a thing. Wasteland 3 was my 4th review after 100%, and I had so much fun doing it and exploring all the avenues and everything that making that video is really where the idea of doing it all the time kind of clicked into place for me because I enjoyed it that much. But Wasteland 3 is of course an isometric team-based RPG where we make all sorts of decisions involving post-apocalyptic Colorado and its ruler, the Patriarch, and his brood of malcontent children. But it's a game with a lot of unique flavor, and in many ways it's very different from Wasteland 2, to be honest, but it did so much stuff that was really fun and interesting, and it was presented in a way that was pretty easily digestible as well, on top of just having some fun combat. And what I really loved about this game in particular was the act of finding everything, uncovering the secrets. I've mentioned this, but many of the guides on Steam I actually wrote personally. I contributed to the 100% guide on Steam quite a bit, and that was because I just found myself engrossed in figuring out all these little puzzles around nailing some of the achievements, the more secret aspects of the game, like the cyborg chicken and the golden toaster. It's just a game that had so much going on. I got really engrossed in kind of figuring it all out, to the point where it actually gave me the idea to make it more of a full-time thing. But in spite of that, Wasteland 3 remains one of the games that I had the most fun getting 100% on, despite being one of the first games that I did in this manner. Just as a fun fact, I think the actual first one was Greedfall, if my memory serves. But nonetheless, we are moving on to number 2. Now, this one is primarily for personal reasons, but it is Baldur's Gate 1. Now, in addition to reviewing new games, I also love to review very old games, especially isometric CRPGs, so naturally I wanted to cover Baldur's Gate 1, 2, etc. for the channel ahead of 3's release. However, in the case of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, I had actually played them before. I just hadn't played the enhanced editions. So getting 100% on the enhanced editions was just a great trip down memory lane for me. That involved, of course, remembering where everything was, some of the rules for advanced Dungeons and Dragons even, the timeless story of both of those games, but Baldur's Gate 1 in particular, I've said many times on the channel that one is actually my favorite, because it is. And then you combine that with all the new stuff that the enhanced edition added, like all the extra difficulties, etc., that gave me a new challenge. And by the time I was done with the enhanced edition, I had beaten that game backwards and forwards. And while I sincerely doubt it's a game that would be on a lot of people's lists, as it is relatively clunky by today's standards, to be sure, it was nonetheless a great trip down memory lane for me that made the experience very, very enjoyable. But moving on to number 3, this one might surprise a few people, but this is actually The Outer Worlds. While the game certainly wasn't everybody's cup of tea, I personally thought it was great. I thought the humor was a standout in particular, as you are dealing with sort of corporate dystopia space colonies. which leads to all these really comical situations, but I think the addition of the sci-fi elements and how they were handled is what really made the game for me in particular. So much so that I actually made quite a few videos for this one. One of my favorites was a build that revolved around the science weapons in game. The science weapons had all sorts of just curious effects. One of them would actually reconfigure the NPC you were hitting's face. There was also a shrink ray and some other effects, things like that. And I made a build that actually involved using all of of them. And it wound up being probably my favorite way to play the game because it was just so chaotic and overall just very different. I also really enjoyed the companions of that game, and while I wouldn't pretend to say it was an incredibly deep game or anything, it was nonetheless a game that I really enjoyed my time with it. It was honestly just a lot of simple fun in many cases, as the RPG elements don't go too crazy as it's a relatively short title. But between all the humor, the fun builds that I was messing around with at the time, it's a game I walked away from after getting everything done, and could still say that the entire journey was a lot of just fun nonsense. And I think every once in a while you need a game like that to remind you that video games are supposed to be fun. So while The Outer Worlds is many things to many people, to me, it was a lot of fun. But that brings us to number 4 with an entirely different tone, and that is Elden Ring. Now, truth be told, I doubt I could tell you anything about Elden Ring you haven't already heard at this point, but I will try nonetheless. Elden Ring in particular, I wasn't 100% about going into because I don't play a ton of Souls-likes. Ironically enough, when I do them after 100%, those videos do typically do pretty well, which was certainly the case with Elden Ring, but because I don't play a lot of them, I wasn't really sure how it was going to pan out walking into it, but Elden Ring was one of those games that really surpassed my expectations in every way. Now, that's not to say it didn't have its frustrating moments, because it certainly did. And there are parts of the game I absolutely don't like, it's very true. Nonetheless, though, I think the act of getting 100% was a really good time, because I would hit these sort of roadblocks, usually in the form of a boss. Then I would go mess around in the open world, level up, come back to the boss, eventually beat it, which was a great feeling of satisfaction overall. To the point where I kind of no-lifed that game when it came out. I played for probably like a week and a half straight, and was actually among kind of the first wave of people to get 100% on that title, which I think actually helped my enjoyment a lot. Truth be told, games these days usually have a guide for everything before the game's even released half the time now, due to how things like review cycles work, etc., which, let's be real, I'm kind of a part of. But because Elden Ring was such a dense game that kind of required so much learning and figuring things out, it took a couple of weeks for those guides to really start showing up. So a lot of that stuff I just kind of had to figure out on my own, and this part is truly crazy, I occasionally had to talk to other people about it. And if you couldn't tell by this entire channel, I do love talking to people about video games. And because of that, sort of just that whole process, even admittedly some elements that don't necessarily occur in the game today, such as that situation around the guides and everything, all kind of resulted in a game that was immensely satisfying to actually knock out. And even though there were parts of it that were rougher than others, and truth be told, I don't really have much of an urge to play it now, it was a very, very fun experience. And I can honestly say I'm happy to have done it. But that brings us to the final entry on this list. And believe it or not, this is the original Elex from Piranha Bytes, which was the first game of theirs that I had played. And I fully admit this might be an area where I lose a few people, because Elex is known for being a janky, weird mess. But honestly, just something about this game hooks me in, and I kind of love it. You can go watch my review if you want a more objective take, but faults aside, of which there are many, I love Elex. I don't know what it is specifically about this game, but it really pulled me in. Everything from the power curve to the setting, the lore, the ending, the kind of bad but still also for some reason kind of good voice acting, the janky combat system, all the various approaches to all the quests, all of it just had me really, really engrossed. When I finished this particular game up, I was kind of sad to have to put it down, because again, there was just nothing left to do, as is the nature of these reviews, but the game had really gotten its hooks into me, and the truth be told, I don't think it probably would have worked as well for me if I had previously played Piranha Bytes games. I think Elex being the first game of theirs that I played contributed a lot of this, but admittedly I'm also kind of a sucker for magic meets science fiction, so that could certainly be a big part of it as well. But seeing Jax go from so incredibly weak that almost everything can one-shot him to being just almost unkillable with all these different resources to use, different ways to engage in combat, seeing that slow, steady power curve while exploring a world that I found immensely interesting and original at the same time, all just kind of blended to make an experience that was very unique And like I said, when I finally had to walk away from it, I was a little bit sad to see it go, which is a real shame because Elex 2, I don't think, as a sequel, really followed it up particularly well. I think it did too many of the exact same things and didn't try to push the envelope at all. As a standalone game, I think Elex 2 is mostly okay. You can have a pretty good time with it, sure. They made some fun additions like the jetpack combat, but I really would have loved to see them expand that universe and just really shoot for the moon, because the core of what Elex is such a fascinating premise to me that despite all its jank and rough edges, it's a game that I just loved. But before I gush on for too much longer, that has been 5 games that were incredibly fun for me to 100%, so I hope you enjoyed the list. Let me know down below any games that you particularly enjoy at all, games that were fun, games that are just your favorites, whatever you want to tell me about. I just love talking about games, so leave it down below. Which of course means like, comment, subscribe, all that other YouTube jazz, but more than anything, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.